Welcome to part 2 of the Paul vs. Muhammad series, responding to a Muslim apologist article called, Can Paul be Compared to the Noble Prophet? In part 1, we have looked at the calling, the revelation, and the mental condition of both Paul and Muhammad. As we have seen, Muhammad falls short by the fact that he has been under the influence of Satan's black magic. Now we are going to look at perhaps the most embarrassing fact of Muhammad's life that we encounter in various Islamic sources. Muhammad brings the Satanic verses. Perhaps the most shameful and embarrassing event in the life of their prophet for Muslims is the case of the Satanic verses. This incident records in great detail how Muhammad is embarrassed by presenting a revelation from Satan as a revelation from Allah, and what even ended up in the Quran, only to disappear a little while later. But still, the damage had already been done. Now let us look at how the story of the Satanic verses is represented in the Islamic sources. Because the sources are so many and so extensive, a mere selection will have to be made from the sources that mention it. This way, we prevent it from becoming an entire book, because that's how numerous and extensive the Islamic sources are on this subject. Let's start with the source that the Muslim apologist has also used in his article. As mentioned, it is an extensive piece, but it does give a good picture of what happened according to Islamic tradition and how Muhammad communicated the message of Satan. Under significant heading, Satan casts a false revelation on the tongue of God's messenger. The highly respected Islamic scholar and historian Al-Tabari writes the following in his Tariq, or his history. In Al-Tabari, volume 6, page 107 through 110, the messenger of God was eager for the welfare of his people and wished to effect a reconciliation with them in whatever ways he could. It is said that he wanted to find a way to do this, and what happened was as follows. When the messenger of God saw how his tribe turned their backs on him, and was grieved to see them shunning the message that he had brought to them from God, he longed in his soul that something would come to him from God, which could reconcile him with his tribe. With his love for his tribe and his eagerness for their welfare, it would have delighted him if some of the difficulties which they made for him could have been smoothed out, and he debated with himself and fervently desired such an outcome. Then God revealed, By the star when it sets, your comrade does not err, nor is he deceived, nor does he speak out of his own desire. And when he came to the words, Have you thought upon Allat and Al-Uzza and Manat, the third, the other? Satan cast on his tongue, because of his inner debates and what he desired to bring to his people, the words, These are the high flying cranes. Verily, their intercession is accepted with approval. When the Quraysh heard this, they rejoiced and were happy and delighted at the way in which he spoke of their gods, and they listened to him, while the Muslims, having complete trust in their prophet in respect of the messages which he brought from God, did not suspect him of error, illusion, or mistake. When he came to the prostration, having completed the surah, he prostrated himself, and the Muslims did likewise, following their prophet, trusting in the message which he had brought and following his example. Those polytheists of the Quraysh and others who were in the mosque likewise prostrated themselves because of the reference to their gods which they had heard, so that there was no one in the mosque, believer or unbeliever, who did not prostrate himself. The one exception was Al-Warib bin al-Mughira, who was a very old man and could not prostrate himself, but he took a handful of soil from the valley in his hand and bowed over that. Then they all dispersed from the mosque. The Quraysh left delighted by the mention of their gods which they had heard, saying, Muhammad has mentioned our gods in the most favorable way possible. stating in his revelation that they are the high-flying cranes and that their intercession is received with approval. The news of this prostration reached those of the messenger of God's companions, who were in Abyssinia, and people said, "The Quraysh have accepted Islam." Some rose up to return, while others remained behind. Then Gabriel came to the messenger of God and said, "Muhammad, what have you done? You have recited to the people that which I did not bring to you from God, and you have said that which was not said to you." Then the messenger of God was much grieved and feared God greatly. But God sent down a revelation to him, for he was merciful to him, consoling him and making the matter light for him, informing him that there had never been a prophet or a messenger before him who desired as he desired and wished as he wished, but that Satan had cast words into his recitation, as he had cast words on Muhammad's tongue. Then God canceled what Satan had thus cast, and established his verses by telling him that he was like other prophets and messengers, and revealed, "Never did we send a messenger or a prophet before you, but that when he recited the message, Satan cast words into his recitation. God abrogates what Satan casts. Then God established his verses. God is knower, wise." Thus God removed the sorrow from his messenger, reassured him about what he had feared, and canceled the words which Satan had cast on his tongue, that their gods were high-flying cranes, whose intercession was accepted with approval. He now revealed the following, the mention of Al-At, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the third, the other, the words, "Are yours the males, and his the females? That indeed were an unfair division. They are but names which you have named, you and your fathers," to the words, "To whom he wills and accepts." This means, how can the intercession of their gods avail with God? When Muhammad brought a revelation from God, canceling what Satan had cast on the tongue of his prophet, the Quraysh said, "Muhammad has repented of what he had said concerning the position of your gods with God, and has altered it and brought something else." Those two phrases which Satan had cast on the tongue of the messenger of God were in the mouth of every polytheist, and they became even more ill-disposed and more violent in their persecution of those of them who had accepted Islam and followed the messenger of God. Al-Tabari also quotes a following tradition on pages 111 and 112. The messenger of God was sitting in a large gathering of the Quraysh, wishing that day that no revelation would come to him from God which would cause them to turn away from him. Then God revealed, "By the star when it sets, your companion does not err, nor is the deceived." Until the messenger of God recited it until he came to, "Have you thought upon Al-Lat, Al-Uzza, and Manat, the third, the other?" When Satan cast on his tongue two phrases, "These are the high-flying cranes. Verily their intercession is to be desired." He uttered them and went on to complete the surah. When he prostrated himself at the end of the surah, the whole company prostrated themselves with him. Al-Walid bin al-Mughira raised some dust to his forehead and bowed over that, since he was a very old man and could not prostrate himself. They were satisfied with what Muhammad had uttered and said, "We recognize that it is God who gives life and death, who creates and who provides sustenance. But if these gods of ours intercede for us with him, and if you give them a share, we are with you." That evening, Gabriel came to him and reviewed the surah with him. And when he reached the two phrases which Satan had cast upon his tongue, he said, "I did not bring you these two." Then the messenger of God said, "I have fabricated things against God and have imputed to him words which he has not spoken." Then God revealed to him, "And they strove hard to beguile you away from what we have revealed to you, that you should invent other than it against us. and the words, "And then you have found no helper against us." He remained grief-stricken and anxious until the revelation of the verse, "Never did we send a messenger or a prophet before you," to the words, "God is nowhere wise." When those who had immigrated to Abyssinia heard that all the people of Mecca had accepted Islam, they returned to their clan, saying, "They are more dear to us." But they found that the people had reversed their decision when God canceled what Satan had cast upon the messenger of God's tongue. So much for Al-Tabari. Here's a brief summary of what we've just read. Number 1. Muhammad longed for a revelation that would bring him and the people of his tribe together. Number 2. This desire led Muhammad to quote Surah An-Najm, which Satan, disrupting the revelation of Allah and Muhammad, mistaking Satan's words for Allah's words. Number 3. Everyone, both Muslim and non-Muslim, bowed in worship after completing the chapter. The Muslims did not notice Muhammad's failure, and the people of Mecca were overjoyed that Muhammad had finally honored their gods. Number 4. Muhammad was later rebuked by Gabriel, and they concluded that Muhammad had fabricated a revelation and attributed it to Allah, while it came from Satan. Number 5. Allah revealed a Quranic verse to reassure Muhammad that he was not the only one that this happened to, thereby nullifying what Satan had done. I need not tell anyone how devastating this story is to Muhammad's prophetic ambitions. Not being able to distinguish between revelation from God and a revelation from Satan is quite problematic, to say the least. And this is where Muslims have pinned their eternal hopes on and entrusted their eternal souls with. As already mentioned, this story is widely circulated in Islamic sources. Also, in the so-called authentic hadith collection of Bukhari, we see a reference to this story, although it is a pretty cleaned up version. In Sahih Bukhari, Volume 2, Book 19, number 176, we read, narrated Abdullah ibn Masud, the Prophet recited Surat An-Najm and prostrated while reciting it, and all of the people prostrated. And a man amongst the people took a handful of stones or earth and raised it to his face and said, "This is sufficient for me." Later on, I saw him killed as a non-believer. The same we find in Sahih Bukhari, Volume 2, Book 19, number 173, narrated Abdullah ibn Masud. The Prophet recited Surat An-Najm at Mecca and prostrated while reciting it. And those who were with him did the same, except an old man, who took a handful of small stones or earth and lifted it to his forehead and said, "This is sufficient for me." Later on, I saw him killed as a non-believer. It is also in Sahih al-Bukhari, Volume 2, Book 19, number 177. Narrated Ibn Abbas, the Prophet said, I prostrated while reciting Surat An-Najm, and with him prostrated the Muslims, the pagans, the jinns, and all human beings. The similarities with Al-Tabari's report are clear. The fact that the man took a handful of stones and bowed his face over them because of his old age can also be found in Al-Tabari's account. Surah Al-Najm happened to be the chapter that Muhammad recited when he honored the idols of the people of Mecca, and everyone bowed with him. It is quite logical that the Muslims bowed down with him. After all, he is their prophet. But what do you think is the reason that the non-Muslims, who disliked Muhammad's constant insults of their idols, united in worship with the Muslims right here? Try to come up with another explanation for this, other than the satanic verses, as we read in Al-Tabari's account. Similarly, in the various tafsir, or Quranic commentaries, of Jalalain, Ibn Abbas, Al-Zamakhshari, and a whole list of Islamic scholars, we see something when we read the explanation of Surat Al-Hajj. First, Tafsir Al-Jalalain, Surah 2252. We did not send before you any messenger. This is a prophet who has been commanded to deliver a message. Or prophet, one who has been commanded to deliver anything. But that when he recited the scripture, Satan cast into his recitation that is not from the Quran, but which those to whom he, the prophet, had been sent would find pleasing. The prophet said, during an assembly of the men of the Quraysh, after reciting the following verses from Surah Al-Najm, have you considered Alat and Aliza and Manat, the third one? He added, as a result of Satan casting them onto his tongue without the prophets being aware of it. Then the following words, those are the high-flying cranes, and indeed their intercession is to be hoped for. So they, the men of the Quraysh, were thereby delighted. Gabriel, however, later informed him, the prophet, of this, and that Satan had cast onto his tongue, and he was grieved by it, but was subsequently comforted with this following verse, that he might be reassured of God's pleasure. Thereat God abrogates, nullifies, whatever Satan has cast, and then God confirms his revelations. And God is the knower of Satan's casting of that which has been mentioned. He is wise in his enabling him, that is Satan, to do such things, for he does whatever he wills. End quote. Ibn Kathir comments on the authenticity of this story in his tafsir, but we simply cannot ignore it when he discusses verses 52 of Surah 22, and thus we must mention it as well. He begins his explanation with the following words of this significant title. Tafsir Ibn Kathir, Surah 22:52, how the shaitan threw some falsehood into the words of the messengers, and how Allah abolished it. At this point, many of the scholars of tafsir mention the story of the Giraniq, and how many of those who had migrated to Ethiopia came back when they thought that the idolaters of the Quraysh had become Muslims. But these reports all come through the mursal chains of narration, and I do not think that any of them may be regarded as sahih, and Allah knows best. Al-Bukhari said, Ibn Abbas said, in his recitation of the revelation, when he spoke, the shaitan threw some falsehood into his speech, but Allah abolished that which the shaitan threw in. This verse is nothing but a direct result of the account of the satanic verses, but claims that Muhammad's was thus safeguarded. Mursal also means that it has a complete chain of narrators, but that the chain cannot be traced back to a Sahaba, a companion of Muhammad, but to a Tabi, a successor of the companions of Muhammad. Because this is such a heavy millstone around the neck of the Islamic prophet, Muslim apologists in particular have taken on the task of labeling the story as fabricated and convincing others not to take it seriously. They have done everything they can. The problem is, however, is that this event can be found frequently in the early Islamic sources. These are not Christian sources, nor are they Jewish sources that want to cast Muhammad in a bad light or anything of the sort. They are Islamic sources, recorded by Muslims for Muslims. It is quite implausible to say that the first generation of Muslims would allow themselves to be smeared with such an incriminating story by outsiders or make up their own, with the aim of either making Muhammad look good or embarrassing him. None of these options are plausible or tenable, especially when we consider that there are no less than 18 to 25 sources, according to some, even 37 sources in Islamic literature for the first 2 centuries to which this work can be traced. Of these, 3 isnad chains of narrators, according to the prominent Islamic scholar Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, meet the requirement of authenticity. Beyond that, al-Asqalani says that even if these accounts were all classified as mursal, the collective weight of all of these mursal accounts would still be an indication of the authenticity of this story. And so it is difficult to conclude otherwise than that the satanic verses have really rolled from the lips of Muhammad into the world, and that this is the only possible explanation for their origin and perpetuation. Let's look at Sirat an-Nabi, that is, the life of the Prophet. This report appears in the reports of al-Tabari and in some other historical works, and could possibly be a fact. Here, in the last section of the report, it is told that the story that, once upon a time, with the exception of a few unbelievers, all the people and jinnis bowed with the Holy Prophet, correct is as reported in the Sahih of al-Bukhari, chapter commentary on Surah al-Najm. The rest of the story is clearly an absurd myth that deserves no comment. Most of the great traditionalists, for example, al-Bihani, Qaid Iyad, al-Ini, and al-Maduni, and al-Nuwanwi, have declared it to be false and fabricated. But unfortunately, many traditionalists have recorded it with reference to the chain of narrators. Among them are the well-known ones such as al-Tabari, Ibn al-Hatim, Ibn al-Mundir, Ibn Mudariya, Ibn Ishaq, Musa ibn Ubka, and Abu Mashir. It is therefore especially strange that Ibn Hajar, a renowned authority of the traditions, insists that the story is true and says, quote, "As we have mentioned above, 3 of the chains of narrators meet the condition necessary for an authentic account. These accounts are, however, all Mursal traditions, and those who believe the Mursal traditions are allowed to argue the case on that basis." End quote. Also, Ibn Hajar in Fath al-Bari, 1959 edition, volume 8. Then al-Tabari continued to tell the accounts of it, all weak, but its collective weight points to its authenticity as said by Ibn Hajar in Fath al-Bari. If we follow the developments of the opinions of Islamic scholars about the satanic verses from the earliest stages to the latter centuries within Islam, we see that the first generations did not see the story as a problem for the prophetic career of Muhammad. His prophetic mistake and his subsequent reassurance and restoration by Allah was for them proof that Muhammad was a true prophet. However, later Muslims saw the problem of the satanic verses, especially through the development of the Islamic doctrine of Ishma, or infallibility, and also through their interaction with Christians, who presented Jesus as the spotless Son of God, where Muhammad, just as he has actually spoken the satanic verses, falls completely short and completely glosses over. And so Muslims today are doing their utmost to ignore the story of the satanic verses and to rid themselves of any cognitive dissonance by pretending that it never happened. However, many Islamic scholars say that the story is too widespread among Islamic sources and is accepted by virtually all early Islamic scholars in the first few centuries of Islam to be swept under the rug. The story of the satanic verses simply runs us through too many paths to Muhammad to suggest that it has no basis in history. And to this conclusion also comes the Islamic scholar Ibn Taymiyyah, who is called Sheikh al-Islam and loved by Salafi Muslims. Ibn Taymiyyah did believe in the principle of Ismat Abinya, that is, the infallibility of the prophets, but believed that this principle meant that the prophets did not persist in their mistakes, not that they could not make mistakes. In his work, Ibn Taymiyyah consistently accepts and defends the historical base of the satanic verses and sees it as evidence of Muhammad's prophetic calling. It gets a bit technical here, but for the attentive reader, the next information will prove to be quite valuable. Let's look at Sahab Abed Ibn Taymiyyah and the Satanic Verses, pages 76 and 77. They say, the reports and explanation of this verse in the books of Tafsir and Hadith are well known and reliable, and the Quran is in agreement with these reports. For God's abrogation of what Satan casts and his establishing his signs is precisely so as to remove what has fallen into his ayat, and is to distinguish truth from falsehood, so that his ayat are not confused with anything else, while the making of that which is Satan's is cast as a trial for those in whose hearts there is sickness, and for those whose hearts are hardened, and can only happen if what was cast was something external, which the people heard, and not something internal, that is, of the soul. And also, in the same source, page 80, if Mursal or plural of mursal, chains, are transmitted by a number of chains of transmitters, and these reports are free of the possibility of having been fabricated through deliberate collusion or of agreeing without deliberate design, then they are indubitably sound. If the hadith has been transmitted by two or more chains, and it is known that the transmitters did not collude in its fabrication, and it is also known that such reports could not agree with each other by chance and without deliberate design, then it becomes known that the hadith is sound. Sahab Ahmed sums up Ibn Taymiyyah's argument against the authenticity of the Satanic verses as follows, on page 84 of his doctrinal thesis, quote, "Unlike the majority of jurists, he does not stipulate that a hadith must be transmitted by a specific number of rahurayas in order for it to be considered mutawatir, nor that the transmissions agree in wording. For him, if the information in question has been widely accepted as true in the early community, then the transmission is considered mutawatir. This is so even if the reports disagree in the making, but agree in the meaning, in which case the transmission is deemed as matawatara manahu, that is, a transmission of the meaning of which it is established by common or current transmission." Ibn Taymiyyah points out that acceptably Sahih hadiths also disagree in details. Quote, "If someone transmits a long story with all sorts of things in it, and someone else transmits it with a similar manner to the first person without having colluded with him, then the whole story cannot be an error, just as the whole story cannot be a lie. Rather, an error may enter such a transmission in some parts of the story, such as the case of the Prophet's purchase of a camel from Jabir. Anyone who contemplates its chains of transmission will know categorically that the hadith is sound, even though the transmitters disagree over the price of the camel." Again, this story can only be found in the earliest Islamic sources. So to say that this story cannot be trusted and was massively fabricated by the first generations of Muslims and that they were therefore a bunch of unreliable liars is a big line through the account of all Islamic knowledge that Muslims pretend to possess, because it immediately makes all other sources suspicious. In other words, it is an impossible position for any serious student of Islamic literature. And as if the misery does not stop for our Muslim friends, here is another salient detail that we find in the Quran. We have already seen in the previous part of the series that Muhammad was under the influence of satanic magic. In this part, we have seen how he passed on a message from Satan to his followers. But again, if we are to believe the Quran, Satan has no influence on those who trust in Allah. Verse 98, when you recite the Quran, seek refuge with Allah from Satan the accursed. Certainly he has no authority over those who believe and put their trust in their Lord. His authority is only over those who take him as a patron, and who, under his influence, associate others with Allah in worship. But we just read that Satan did influence Muhammad. So if this verse in the Quran is true, then Muhammad is either one who associates partners with Allah, or one who takes Satan as a protector. How can anyone trust Muhammad as a spiritual leader? And he must represent the prophet of the prophets. The satanic verses are not only problematic with regard to Surah 16, 98 through 100, but more importantly, it is also biblically damning for Muhammad that he claimed to be a prophet in line with the previous prophets. For if he is to be judged according to the criterion of those previous prophets, the following condemnation of Muhammad looms. Deuteronomy 18 verse 20. But the prophet who presumes to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. This verse is especially embarrassing for Muslim apologists because when they want to try to find Muhammad in the Bible, they quote Deuteronomy 18:18 and try to say it's about Muhammad. But we've already seen that Deuteronomy 18:18 cannot be about Muhammad. But if we're looking for a verse that fits Muhammad like a glove, then we really have to look 2 verses later in verse 20, as we've just quoted. Thus, the Bible does not prove that Muhammad is a true prophet. The Bible proves that he is a false prophet. As Muhammad said himself, I have fabricated things against God and have imputed to him words which he has not spoken. He really spoke as if he had Deuteronomy 18:20 in mind, thus unmistakably condemning and disqualifying himself as a true prophet. So if we compare the mental states of Paul and Muhammad here again, we see that Paul was steadfast in delivering his message. He could easily identify the difference between God's revelations and Satan's perversions, and therefore there is no reason to question Paul's mental state. However, if we look at Muhammad's mental state, we see that his reliability is quite lacking, and I'm putting it mildly. Even if he had the best of intentions, he was not stable and could not identify the difference between a revelation from Allah and a revelation from Satan. He was under satanic powers through black magic, and according to Surah 16, verses 98 through 100, is condemned as someone who committed shirk or was a servant of Satan. For that reason, we must seriously question his qualifications as the spiritual leader of those who seek God in truth. This is the end of part 2. And in part 3, the last part of this series, we will compare the integrity, the honesty, and the attitude of these individuals towards their respective peoples. Thanks again for watching. God bless you, and we'll see you again in part 3.